In the misty town of Maple Hollow, by the silver still waters of the lake, a lone figure sat each morning motionless, vigilant, eternal. His name was Shadow, a German shepherd with storm-colored fur and eyes that carried the weight of waiting. 3 winters, 1,000 sunrises, and still he waited, for the boy who vanished beneath the waves, and the promise only he remembered. But what if the world hadn't forgotten? And what if far away a boy was still dreaming of the dog he left behind? This is the story of Shadow the dog who never gave up and the girl who made a miracle happen. Chapter 1. The Silhouette by the Lake. The town of Maple Hollow, nestled deep in the pine-thick heart of Vermont, moved with the pace of memory. Summers were brief, and golden winters long and whispering, and spring always arrived a little late like a forgotten promise. It was a place where stories didn't just survive, they took root, echoing through generations like wind through leaves. The lake at the town's edge. Lake Calverton mirrored the sky in all seasons, holding fog in the morning and stars at night. It was there on the splintered remains of an old wooden dock that a silent figure sat each dawn and dusk. Shadow. He was a German shepherd 7 years old, with a frame both regal and weary. His fur bore the deep iron gray of weathered stone flecked with silver at the muzzle and ears. Once a proud dog with a youthful gait, Shadow now carried time in the tilt of his posture. His eyes were dark, full of weight, not of anger or pain, but of memory. They were the eyes of one who had seen too much and yet kept hoping for more. Every morning just before the sun pushed the fog back from the lake's surface, Shadow would emerge from beneath the willow tree beside the dock. He would sit in the exact same spot, head high, tail curled beside him, gaze fixed on the shimmering water. For 3 long years he had not missed a single morning. No one quite remembered when Shadow first appeared at the dock, only that one day he was there and then he never left. Some said he belonged to a boy named Eli who had drowned in a boating accident, though no body had ever been found. Others whispered that Eli had been rescued and taken away, but the family never returned. What united them all was the belief that Shadow was waiting for Eli for something for someone. The first to truly notice the dog's vigil was Harold Lyman, a retired boatwright who lived in a small cedar cabin near the south end of the lake. Harold was in his 70s, a wiry man with sun-leathered skin and hands like cracked bark. His face was a map of time and smoke eyes the color of old denim. Widowed for over a decade, Harold rarely spoke more than necessary, and even less since his daughter had stopped visiting. He spent his days carving wooden birds and fixing the odd fishing skiff. But each morning he would leave out a metal bowl filled with fresh water and a second with a scoop of dried meat and eggs for the dog who asked for nothing. Harold had never tried to pet Shadow, nor did he attempt to leash him. He understood in a way only old men and old dogs understand, that silence sometimes said more than words. It wasn't sympathy that drove Harold's kindness, it was recognition. Both of them had lost someone once and neither had moved on. Maple Hollow residents soon grew used to the sight of Shadow. Tourists stopped to snap photos. Children called to him from the road. But Shadow never moved, not unless it was to follow the sun back to the shelter of the willow tree at twilight. His devotion became part of the town's soul, like the chime of the church bell, or the scent of pine wood smoke drifting from chimneys. One rainy afternoon, a woman named Lydia Caldwell stood watching Shadow from the footpath near the boathouse. Lydia was tall and graceful in a worn pale green raincoat, her hair a chestnut brown drawn into a loose bun. She was 38 and had the eyes of someone who smiled politely but rarely meant it. A recent arrival to the town, Lydia had moved to Maple Hollow with her daughter after the loss of her husband in a work accident in Ohio. Seeking distance from memory and the weight of condolences, she had chosen this quiet lakeside town for its forgetfulness. She had watched the dog for days now while walking her daughter home from school. "There's something about him," she murmured aloud, not realizing Harold was standing a few paces behind her with his hands in his coat pockets. "Aye. He's waiting," Harold said without preamble, his voice a low gravel. Lydia turned startled. "For what?" "For who more likely," he replied, then shrugged. Some say a boy named Eli. Drowned 3 years back. Never found a body. Dog's been here ever since." Lydia looked back at the dog who sat still as sculpture. "He hasn't moved an inch." "He's got nowhere else to be," Harold muttered before tipping his hat and walking on. As the days passed into weeks, Shadow's silent vigil stirred something deeper in Lydia. She saw in him the same devotion that had once lived in her husband's eyes before the accident, before the silence. And while Lydia remained cautious, her daughter was not. Madeline Caldwell was 10 years old, all curiosity and wild hair. Her freckles were scattered like stars across her cheeks, and she wore mismatched socks as a personal statement. Though she rarely spoke in class, her notebooks were full of secret stories and sketches of animals, mostly dogs. One afternoon, as Lydia tried to coax her daughter to hurry along the path home, Madeline froze beside the dock. "He's beautiful," she whispered, staring at Shadow. "Yes, darling, but he's not ours." "Then whose is he?" Lydia sighed. "No one's. Or maybe everyone's." Madeline didn't respond. Instead, she crouched down just a few feet away from the dock and sat cross-legged on the grass. Shadow glanced at her briefly but said nothing. Lydia hesitated, then let her be. That moment became routine. Each afternoon after school, Madeline would stop by the lake and sit in quiet company with Shadow. She didn't talk to him, not at first, but eventually she began to hum tunes, recite lines from books, and once even read aloud a short story she had written about a dragon who refused to fly until the moon came back. Shadow never moved, but sometimes his ears twitched when she read. To Madeline, that was enough. She began asking questions about him. First to her mother, then to their elderly neighbor, then eventually to Harold himself. One evening, standing in Harold's workshop while he varnished a canoe, Madeline asked, "Do you think he remembers the boy?" Harold wiped his hands on a cloth. "I think he remembers something better, Hope." As summer edged closer and the lilacs bloomed, Shadow remained a constant, and for the first time since her father died, Madeline smiled more. She laughed when Shadow chased a butterfly once, just once, and she began to leave little gifts near the dock, a red scarf, a bone-shaped biscuit, a small stone painted with the word friend. Still, Shadow never moved from his place by the water's edge. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Moved In, and a Gentle Heart. Madeline Caldwell had always been the sort of girl who found stories where others saw silence. Her world was built from dog-eared library books, old marbles found under floorboards, and clouds she imagined as whales drifting through the sky. But since her father's accident, something inside her had gone quiet. The stories she once told at dinner now stayed tucked away in her journal. Her laughter had softened into a smile that never quite reached her eyes. When her mother moved them to Maple Hollow in search of peace, Madeline didn't protest. She simply packed her books, her scarf with the purple stars, and one photograph her father kneeling beside her, and a chocolate Labrador they'd once owned Baxter. Their new home stood just a 5-minute walk from Lake Calverton, a weathered blue house with creaky stairs and ivy creeping up the back porch. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemons and old pine, and every window looked out onto something green. To Madeline, it felt like stepping into a forgotten chapter of someone else's book. Lydia, her mother, tried her best. She had the sort of beauty that didn't fade with age, slender, long-limbed, with sharp cheekbones and tired green eyes. Once an elementary school art teacher, Lydia had quit after the accident, unable to return to the halls where her husband once volunteered on weekends. Grief had rearranged her from the inside out. She spoke softly, as if not to startle her own sadness. On their second week in Maple Hollow, Lydia caught Madeline sitting on the footpath near the lake. No books, just silence. Nearby, Shadow sat as always, silent sentinel of the water. Lydia frowned. "You shouldn't be too close," she said. "He's not a pet. He's wild." "He's not wild," Madeline replied without looking up. "He's waiting." That word stayed with Lydia longer than she expected. Madeline began visiting Shadow every day after school. She brought a piece of her sandwich, or sometimes just herself. The dog rarely acknowledged her, but she didn't seem to mind. She talked anyway about the book she was reading, about the way the birds flew just before the rain came, about how people always walked faster when they were sad. She never touched him, never crossed the invisible line that seemed to encircle the dock. And somehow that earned his trust. One afternoon, while Madeline recited a poem she'd memorized, Shadow stood and padded quietly toward her. He didn't sit close just beside her, close enough that their shadows touched. She didn't speak. She just smiled. From behind a nearby shed, Harold watched the exchange. "Stubborn old mutt," he muttered, though there was no scorn in his voice, only wonder. Later that week, Madeline wandered into Harold's workshop, drawn by the sound of a bandsaw and the warm scent of cedar. The boatwright's hands were deep in a strip of mahogany shaping the ribs of a canoe. He looked up, eyebrows raised, but didn't speak. "You're Mr. Harold, right?" she asked, brushing sawdust from a wooden stool before sitting. "Just Harold's fine." Madeline looked around. The walls were lined with shelves of varnished jars, coiled ropes, and bird carvings, so lifelike she thought they might flutter away. In one corner sat a dusty old radio playing low jazz. She spotted a black and white photo pinned near the door, a younger Harold smiling beside a woman with dark curls and a crooked grin. "She's pretty," Madeline said. "She was," Harold replied, not unkindly. "Long time ago." The silence stretched. Madeline pulled out a folded napkin with a badly drawn dragon on it. "I wrote a story," she said. "It's about a dragon who waits in a cave for a knight who never comes back." Harold nodded slowly. "Sounds like someone I know." Madeline's eyes brightened. Shadow Harold set down his plane. "I figured you'd ask eventually. That's how it began." Each day after school, Madeline would stop by the lake, visit Shadow, then wander over to Harold's. Some days he'd tell her stories of the boats he'd built or about the time he chased off a raccoon that had tried to steal a canoe paddle. Other days he spoke of Shadow. "His name wasn't always Shadow," Harold said one rainy Thursday. "Boy who owned him called him Buddy." "Eli?" Madeline asked. Harold nodded. "Sweet kid. Brown curls, full of questions. You'd have liked him. Whole town loved him, too. Used to come help me sand boats. One summer he even built a birdhouse from scratch. Gave it to his mom for her birthday." "What happened?" Harold didn't answer right away. He took a long breath, ran his fingers along the edge of a model sailboat. One day he and his father went out on the lake. Storm came in fast. Boat flipped. They found the father near the shore. Eli was never found. Madeline sat in silence. Shadow showed up 3 days later. Harold continued. "Sat right there on the dock. Just waited. And he's been waiting ever since." Madeline's voice dropped to a whisper. "He didn't even try to leave. Not once." A week later, Madeline returned to the workshop holding a plastic folder. Inside was a short story titled "The Dog Who Waited for the Moon." She handed it to Harold, who read every word slowly, his lips moving. When he finished, he smiled. "You've got something there," he said. "Keep writing." They began to meet more intentionally after that. Harold showed her how to whittle a block of pine into a tiny canoe. She taught him the lyrics to a song she'd learned at school. He called her Kid, and she called him Captain. They never said what they were both thinking, that somehow through Shadow, their broken pieces had found one another. One evening, just before dusk, Harold handed Madeline a yellowed envelope. "Eli once left this for Shadow. Said he'd give it to him after the summer trip. He never got the chance." The envelope was never opened. On the front in messy handwriting were the words, "To Buddy. Read only if I don't come back." Madeline held it like a treasure. Chapter 3. The White Lie and the Secret Beneath the Lake. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring when the truth began to stir. The trees surrounding Maple Hollow were dressed in a fresh green veil, their leaves whispering in the breeze like old women sharing secrets. The lake, calm and mirror-like, held the sky gently in its grasp. In the shadows of Harold's aging boathouse, Madeline poked around with the curiosity only a child could carry, equal parts reverence and rebellion. The old boathouse had been standing long before Madeline was born, its wooden beams cracked with time and covered in lichen. It leaned slightly to one side as if listening to the stories the wind carried in from the water. Harold had warned her not to go poking around the storage loft. It was full of nails, wasps, and forgotten things. But today, Madeline felt pulled by something she couldn't name. She climbed the creaking wooden ladder, each rung groaning under her weight. At the top, the loft smelled of aged canvas and cedar dust. She wandered past coiled ropes, a stack of unused buoys, and an old tackle box rusted shut. In the far corner, nearly hidden beneath a moth-eaten sail, she found a small tin box, its lid held down with twine. It was no bigger than a lunchbox, but it felt heavy in her hands. Carefully, Madeline untied the twine and opened it. Inside were a few photographs, their edges curled and yellowed with time. One showed a boy about 10 standing beside a younger-looking shadow, then known as Buddy. The boy's grin was crooked, his hair wild with wind, his arm thrown affectionately around the dog's neck. The second photo showed the same boy on a small wooden boat, waving toward the camera lake, waters glistening behind him. Beneath the photos, folded carefully, was a red cloth, a scarf frayed but intact. Embroidered near the corner in uneven stitching was a single word, Buddy. Madeline's breath caught in her chest. She held the scarf gently, as if afraid it might dissolve. Something about the images and the tangible presence of the scarf made the story she'd heard from Harold more than just a tale. It made it real, and real stories needed endings. She descended the ladder quietly, box clutched to her chest. That evening at the dinner table, Lydia noticed something different in her daughter. Madeline's eyes had taken on a gleam of determined wonder, the kind Lydia hadn't seen in months. "What did you do today, sweetheart?" Lydia asked, trying to sound casual as she passed the mashed potatoes. "I found something," Madeline said, her voice quiet but steady. "In Harold's boathouse. I think it belonged to Eli." Lydia's fork paused mid-air. "You shouldn't have been in there alone. It's not safe." "But I was careful," Madeline said quickly. "And I found this." She slid the tin box across the table. Lydia opened it and examined the contents in silence. When she reached the scarf, her hand trembled slightly. "I need your help," Madeline said. Lydia looked up. "With what? I want to find him, Eli. What if he didn't drown Mom? What if he's alive?" Lydia's heart twisted. "Madeline, sometimes people hold on to hope because the truth is too painful. You need to understand that not every story ends with a reunion. But this one might." Madeline pressed. "Please, just help me try." For a moment Lydia didn't answer. She stared at the photo, at the boy who looked nothing like her late husband but still made her chest ache. Finally she nodded. "We'll ask around, but no promises, okay?" That night, after Madeline had gone to bed, Lydia sat by the kitchen window with the tin box in her lap. The stars were out silver against the dark quilt of the sky. She remembered the whispers when they'd first moved to town, that the lake had taken someone. She had dismissed them as small-town folklore. Now, holding the photograph, she wasn't so sure. The next day, Lydia and Madeline visited the Maple Hollow Historical Society, a one-room building run by a woman named Marge Templeton. Marge was in her late 60s, stout with a no-nonsense manner and a fondness for floral print cardigans. Her hair dyed an enthusiastic auburn framed her round face like a lion's mane. She greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd seen enough tragedy in her years cataloging the town's past. When shown the photographs, Marge's brow furrowed. "That's the Johnson boy. Eli. Poor thing." "So you remember him?" Madeline asked eagerly. Marge nodded slowly. "They were good folks. The father died in the lake accident. The boy, well, they never found his body. The mother moved away not long after." "Do you know where?" Lydia asked. Marge tapped her chin. "Last I heard, she had a cousin in Burlington. But that was years ago." That was all Madeline needed. Over the next week, Madeline and Lydia visited the town library, browsed archived newspapers, and even reached out to the local post office to ask if any forwarding addresses had been filed. It was there they met Mr. Darby, a thin, balding man with a hunched back and an encyclopedic memory. He wore suspenders over a pale blue shirt and spoke with the precision of someone who hated being wrong. "I do recall forwarding mail for a Martha Johnson to a P.O. box in South Burlington," he said, after much squinting. "But that was maybe 8-9 years ago." With this fragile lead, Lydia made some phone calls and managed to trace a property rental agreement to a mobile home park outside the city. But when they drove there on a rainy Saturday, the manager, a thin woman named Tina with short platinum hair and a face like cracked porcelain, told them Martha had moved again several years prior. "You might try St. Albans," she offered with a shrug. "Last I heard she was staying with her sister. Eli might be with her." Back in the car, Madeline clutched the red scarf tightly. "We're getting closer," she whispered. Lydia gave a small, hopeful smile. "Let's keep looking." Chapter 4. The Journey for the Truth. The road to answers began not with certainty, but with the folding of a single map creased at the edges, stained with coffee rings, and dotted with hopeful red X's. Madeline traced one such mark with her finger as the morning sun spilled across the kitchen table. Her eyes, dark with determination, flicked up to meet her mother's. "We have to go to St. Albans," she said. Lydia sighed but didn't object. The weight in her daughter's voice reminded her of herself at 10 before life had taught her to fold her hopes so tightly. "We'll need Harold," she said. Harold Lyman stood outside his boathouse that morning with a fishing rod slung over his shoulder. When Lydia and Madeline approached, he looked them over with his usual squint, then raised an eyebrow as if he already knew what they were going to say. "You found more?" he asked. Madeline nodded and held up the worn scarf. "We think we're close." Harold scratched his chin. "St. Albans, huh? Long way to go for a maybe?" "But what if it's a yes?" Madeline said. He looked down at the girl, saw the reflection of a younger him in those stubborn eyes, and gave a half smile. "Let me get my jacket." The trio set out that Saturday, driving through winding roads, flanked by pines tall as memories. The car smelled faintly of old leather and road trip snacks. Shadow, though not in the car, lingered in every silence. He had remained back in Maple Hollow under the watchful eye of Mr. Frederick, a neighbor with kind eyes and a backyard full of squirrels. But even from miles away, his presence shaped the trip. St. Albans was a town of red-bricked buildings, bakery windows lined with pies and old lampposts strung with flower baskets. At the edge of town stood a long, squat building with a faded sign, "Maple Haven Transitional Housing." This, they learned, had once housed a Martha Johnson and her son Eli. At the front desk sat a woman named Clara Bell, mid-40s, with tightly curled hair dyed jet black and glasses that slipped down her nose. She wore a blue cardigan with a coffee stain at the hem and spoke in a southern drawl despite having lived in Vermont most of her life. When Lydia mentioned Martha's name, Clara tapped her fingers on the counter. "Sure, I remember them. Quiet folks. Nice boy. He was always at the library, read more than most grown-ups I know. They left maybe 4 years back. Moved south, I think. Tennessee, maybe." "Do you have any forwarding address?" Lydia asked. Clara hesitated, then leaned in. "Legally, I'm not supposed to give that out. But the boy used to draw these little cartoons for my daughter. Said he wanted to make graphic novels someday, so for old time's sake, let me check the files." She disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she handed Lydia a slip of paper. "This is all I got." The address pointed to a small town in Tennessee called Millersville, barely a dot on the map. It was further than any of them expected, but it was a trail. That evening, Madeline wrote a letter. Her handwriting was careful, her words practiced, yet trembling with emotion. She didn't know if Eli would read it, but she needed to try. "Dear Eli, My name is Madeline. I live in Maple Hollow now. There's a dog here named Shadow, but his real name used to be Buddy. He waits at the dock every day. He never leaves. People say he's waiting for someone he loves. I think that someone is you. I found pictures of you and him in an old box and a scarf with his name on it. I don't know everything, but I think he's still hoping to see you again. I thought you should know that he never stopped waiting. Love, Madeline. She placed the letter in a brown envelope along with one of the photographs she'd found Buddy on the dock, gazing across the water. Lydia mailed it the next morning, uncertain whether it would ever reach the intended hands. 3 weeks passed. Madeline tried not to count the days, but each morning she checked the mailbox. Shadow, too, seemed different, restless. He paced more, watched the road. Once he barked at a car that slowed near the dock, something he hadn't done in years. Then one rainy afternoon the phone rang. Lydia answered, her voice steady but cautious. Madeline stood nearby, holding her breath. A moment passed. Then Lydia covered the mouthpiece, looked at her daughter, and nodded. It's them. Eli Johnson was now 15, tall for his age, with unruly hair and a quiet voice that cracked at the edges. He was built like someone still growing into his own limbs, awkward elbows and broad shoulders. His mother Martha had aged since Maple Hollow. Her once soft features had grown thinner, her voice gentler from years of grief kept quiet. They had believed Buddy died the day of the storm. When no one had found the dog and no trace of him surfaced, they assumed he was lost to the lake. When they received Madeline's letter, Martha cried for the first time in months. Eli didn't speak. He simply packed his backpack and waited by the door. They agreed to return. That Saturday, as the rain cleared and Maple Hollow woke beneath a pale sun, Harold, Lydia, and Madeline stood by the dock. Shadow sat near them, tail curled tight, ears twitching with every new sound. Then a car pulled up, a blue SUV. Eli stepped out first. Shadow stood. Their eyes met. There was a moment, long stretching silent, where no one breathed. Then Shadow bolted. He ran, paws thudding on damp earth, until he reached the boy, now a young man. Eli dropped to his knees as Shadow leapt into his arms. The dog whimpered, not from pain but relief, and Eli buried his face in Shadow's fur. "I thought you were gone," Eli murmured. "I thought you left me." Shadow licked his cheek as if to say, "I never did." Chapter 5. Reunion in the evening light. The sky above Maple Hollow blushed with soft amber as the sun began its slow descent behind the pine-lined ridge. The lake glimmered like glass touched by gold, and the town, usually quiet in the late hours, was humming with anticipation. Word had spread fast. Eli Johnson, the boy, who had once vanished with the storm, was coming home. The townsfolk gathered near the dock, some holding mugs of warm cider, others wrapped in knit scarves, though spring was in full swing. There was an unspoken reverence in the air, as if the return of one boy and one dog was somehow enough to mend every heartbreak the town had ever known. And maybe, just maybe, it was. Madeline stood at the water's edge, her small hands wrapped gently around Shadow's collar. She had dressed in her best, the purple dress with white buttons that Lydia had sewn by hand last year, and a yellow ribbon in her hair. Shadow, no longer still as stone, paced slightly at her side, his eyes flicking toward every car that approached, every voice that rose above a whisper. From the crowd, Miss Eleanor, a retired librarian with silver hair piled high and an ivory brooch shaped like a book, stood beside Deputy Ray, a lanky man in his 50s with a drawl as slow as molasses, and a heart far softer than his uniform suggested. Eleanor whispered, "That dog never gave up." 3 years. Can you imagine? Ray nodded, doffing his hat in respect. "I've seen folks give up after 3 minutes. Near the back of the crowd, Harold stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes shining with something only he understood. He wore his old Navy windbreaker and had even polished his boots, though he'd deny it if asked. Then the blue SUV turned the corner. Everything stopped. The car rolled slowly down the gravel road, tires crunching against pebbles as it pulled to a gentle halt. The door opened. Eli stepped out first. Now 15. Eli was no longer the child in the photograph Madeline had found. He was taller, lean, his shoulders broader, but his eyes, those soft, searching eyes, were unchanged. He wore a denim jacket, scuffed sneakers, and in his hand he clutched a folded letter. Shadow froze. The air trembled between them. Buddy Eli's voice rang out across the lakefront, thin but firm, as if daring time itself to step aside. Shadow launched forward. His paws pounded the dirt path, ears back, tail unfurling in wild arcs. He reached Eli in seconds, leaping into the boy's arms with a yelp that was more a cry of recognition than mere excitement. Eli dropped to his knees, burying his face in Shadow's thick coat, the dog whining and licking at every inch of him as if to confirm again and again that he was real. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. A few wiped their eyes, some clapped. But most simply stood in silent awe, bearing witness to the miracle of loyalty fulfilled. Harold's hand found his chest. Lydia blinked away tears and reached for Madeline's shoulder. The girl, though trembling, didn't cry. She simply watched the reunion with a peace so profound it seemed to still the breeze itself. "I thought you were gone," Eli whispered, gripping the fur behind Shadow's ears. "I thought I lost you." Shadow whined, nudged the boy's chest, then rested his forehead against it, still and resolute. Martha stepped out of the car next. She wore a navy coat and her hair was pinned in soft curls. Her face, lined by years of sorrow, had softened somehow in the light. She looked at Harold first, and for a moment both simply nodded, two people who had lost more than words could ever carry. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Eli remained kneeling beside Shadow on the dock. Madeline approached quietly, the red scarf with Buddy embroidered still folded in her hand. "I think he wants you to have this," she said. Eli looked up, his voice catching. "You're Madeline, right?" She nodded. You brought us back together." Madeline shrugged with a small smile. "I just found a box." "No," Eli said firmly. "You believed when no one else did." Behind them, Lydia was speaking with Martha, who now held her hands with grateful urgency. "I can never repay you," Martha said, her voice rough but genuine. "But I want you to know. I never stopped thinking about him. I just couldn't face the lake. Not without both of them." Lydia gave a knowing nod, her grip tightening. "We all carry echoes of what we've lost. And sometimes those echoes become a compass." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the town left the lakeside one by one, leaving only the family that had finally become whole again. Eli sat on the dock with Shadow curled at his feet. Madeline sat beside him, swinging her legs gently. "I used to write letters to him," Eli said, reaching into his pocket and unfolding the worn paper, "after we moved. But I never sent them. I thought it'd make things harder." Madeline looked out at the water. "Maybe now. You can finish them." He nodded. "Yeah. Maybe we can finish them together." A breeze rustled the reeds by the shore. The lake, bathed in dusk's lavender glow, held their reflections like a memory kept safe. Shadow shifted, laid his head in Eli's lap, and let out a long, contented sigh. The wait was over, but their story was just beginning. In a world where everything moves too fast and people often forget to look back, Shadow's story reminds us of a truth we all carry in our hearts, that love never truly disappears. It waits, quietly, patiently. Sometimes at the edge of a dock, sometimes in the pages of an old letter, sometimes in the eyes of a loyal friend. Maybe you've lost someone. Maybe you're still waiting. Or maybe, like Madeline, you're the one meant to help someone else find their way home. Whatever the case, this story is a gentle reminder that the promises made with the heart are never really broken. They're just waiting to be fulfilled. If Shadow's journey touched your heart today, please share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment to tell us what part moved you most, and if you believe in the power of love, faith, and reunion, write Amen below to let your light shine. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that warm the soul. May God bless you and everyone still waiting for something or someone to come home.